So often in aviation, we promote the virtue of saying no, recognizing when external conditions like weather or terrain are unsafe for a proposed flight, that despite operational pressures, flying in the face of danger isn't worth the risk. While the number of pilots who live by this message is thankfully rising, many of us overlook a similar message when facing the obstacles within ourselves. Our guest today is Kevin Humphreys. Kevin is a helicopter pilot and a mental health ambassador from Australia. He served 20 years in the Australian Army, completing operational tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and humanitarian operations in Papua New Guinea. During his service, Kevin fell victim to PTSD, anxiety, and depression, ailments he buried deep inside himself until they culminated in a mental breakdown. With the help of those around him, Kevin was able to build himself back from his lowest point. Now, he hopes to use his experience to fight the stigma against mental illness and prove that anxiety and depression are not aberrations to be ashamed of, but natural forces to confront and manage. In this conversation with Kevin, we'll examine mental health in aviation. How can we allow ourselves to be vulnerable and address our internal struggles in an industry that often rewards toughing it out? Kevin will take us through his personal journey, the shame he dealt with at his breaking point, his path to recovery, and how looking to a character in a 1970s sci-fi series motivated him to believe in himself again. I'm Bruce Webb, and this is Push to Talk, Episode 11, Better, Stronger, Faster, with Kevin Humphreys. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bruce.
Tell us about yourself, just in broad strokes.
You'll tell in a minute or so from the accent that I'm not from around here. So I'm Australian and over here at Heli Expo right at the moment to come and share my helicopter geekness. Having been an Army helicopter pilot in Australia for 20 years, flying Black Hawk and Chinook, and then flown search and rescue and EMS for about another 10, 12 years on the BK and Bell 412 and the Augusta 139. Now, the little piece in the middle there that's the reason we're talking today is that towards the end of my Army time, I fell in a heap psychologically, contemplated suicide, had a breakdown, took a long time to get back to work, but I did eventually get back to work, got back on my feet and got back in the air again. And so even though I left the Army, I went on to a civil flying career, operational pilot, flight instructor, flight examiner, chief pilot, director of operations, and mental illness is something that our industry is not talking about, certainly not talking about anywhere near enough. That's my background in a very small nutshell.
Well, I think, and it's not just our industry, Kevin, it's our society, it's our world. I have a friend, and we did a podcast episode with Gary Maddox a few months ago, and Gary said the quickest way to clear a room is to talk about mental health. He says, you bring that subject up, people flee. You know, how tragic, because a mental health crisis is no different than having a liver function failure or breast cancer or, a broken arm. I mean, it is a physical ailment. We have a tendency to think, well, you know what, just get over it.
Yeah. And you know what makes it doubly tragic? In the US, over 50% of people will experience a mental illness in their lifetime, mental illness or mental disorder. In Australia, the stats are pretty similar. It's greater than 45%. In the US, someone dies by suicide every 11 minutes. So in the course of this podcast, 5 or 6 people statistically will take their life.
Right.
Which in the US, which is just tragic. In Australia, 7 out of every 9 suicides are men. But who are the first ones to not talk about it? Men.
Absolutely.
So what makes that comment just before about how to empty a room doubly tragic, doubly sad, is the fact that 1 in every 2 of us at some stage will experience it.
Right.
So why aren't we talking about it some more?
Right. Well, I think there's so much shame and guilt wrapped around this, inexplicably, actually. I don't think it would surprise anyone if we said, listen, 50% of the American population will have the flu in their lifetime. We'd be like, well, sure. But when you say 50% of the population will suffer a mental health crisis, people are like, surely not. But honestly, I think those numbers are likely skewed skewed very low because it depends upon how we define a mental health crisis.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So I am so impressed with your willingness to discuss this. So you were in the military and you're flying, honestly, you've got a great career. You're flying Blackhawks and Chinooks in the Australian Army. I'm sure by your outward appearance and behavior and status in life, in other words, achieving things, I'm sure people looked at you and held you up as someone to emulate. I'm sure that they did.
It absolutely did. And it was one of the things when I did have my breakdown, it shocked a number of people. I'd not long returned from Afghanistan as the CO, and we achieved great things over there, really, really good things. And next thing you know, Kev didn't turn up to work.
Right.
And I didn't know who knew what, but what I knew, or at least what I believed, was that everybody knew. Everybody knew. And I was deeply, deeply ashamed. And we'll get to it. I'm sort of jumping a little bit here at the moment, but I was so deeply ashamed that I asked my wife to keep it a secret. And we kept it that way for years and years and years. And it wasn't until about 10 years later when I was talking with one of my peers who's gone on and he's now a major general. He said, Kev, we had no idea, mate. And if anybody was going to fall in a heap, it wasn't going to be you.
Right.
We looked at, the things that you were enduring at the time and wondered, how the hell are you doing it? But how are you doing it so well? And then next thing you know, I just didn't turn up to work. And wow.
Yeah, a catastrophic failure of your mental health.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, certainly I'm not a mental health professional, but I am a person who is very interested in the subject. I would guess that many people who suffer this are not dissimilar from you. I think that it's the hard-charging people who are high achievers that have a very positive self-image. At least they cast that self-image. They project that. I can get it done. If I've got a problem, I can work through it. It's fascinating. If you have cancer or you have any significant ailment, you can't just work through it. You need help. So you knew you had an issue. You shared it with your wife. And I'm sure, and again, your wife's not here, but I'm sure it was a tumultuous time for her too, because someone she loves is in huge distress, but not really getting help. I'm not initially anyway.
No, correct. When I look at my life through the prism of hindsight, then I go back to 2000, my first trip home, my first operational deployment, my first trip home from that. And I had a really bad panic attack on the way in to get a loaf of bread, just a local shopping centre. An involuntary physiological response where I threw myself against the wall to get out of the way of what seemed like a flood of people coming towards me. But it was a total involuntary response. And I didn't tell a soul about that. I was embarrassed. I was confused. I didn't know what just happened. I didn't tell my wife. I didn't tell my work. I certainly didn't tell my work. But I didn't tell my mates. No one was to know about that. One, because I didn't have any words to describe what just happened. But then, come forward to 2003, driving the back streets of Baghdad, brought on PTSD for me, put on a brave face. But a month later, I'm at home now, returned home from deployment, not because of this incident, just because it was my time to rotate out. And I'm waking up in the middle of the night crying and screaming, and what the hell's wrong with me? Right. And again, I'm not telling a soul about it. My wife now knows because she's lying next to me. But apart from that, no one else knows. 2007, I'm in Afghanistan, continually angry, frustrated, cranky. No one, no matter what people are doing, it's never, ever good enough. Super short fuse. And, and then months later, I'm contemplating ending my life and end up, convulsing on the ground, incoherent, sobbing, and my wife standing next to me saying, do you want me to call Martin or Jeff? Now, Martin and Jeff were the unit psychologist and the unit doctor. They knew I wasn't well, but they didn't know how unwell I was because of the mask that I had on very tightly to hide it from people. And even my wife knew that I wasn't well, but didn't know I was that unwell. But here I was now in such a state of distress. Up until that point, got to the point of wanting to take my own life rather than actually
continue.
Call for help. For these two people that were work colleagues who I had their phone numbers in my phone. It was still wanting to end the pain more, was a stronger driver than to reach out and get help. And so then was left for my wife to make the phone call. But it was such a sense of failure and shame, such a huge sense of failure and shame. And that's been the piece that's been, I think, the most common denominator when I talk to other people now about it, is that we as humans don't like to be shamed. And I think there's a massive, massive connection here between pride and shame, as in pride and shame are opposites. And certainly in the military, when you join the military, pride is metaphorically and sometimes physically reinforced.
Sure.
And, be proud of your country, be proud of your service, be proud of your unit, be proud of yourself, be proud, be proud, be proud. And simultaneously, don't you dare go jack on your mates.
Right.
Right? Do not let them down.
Right. Well, we give you ribbons and awards and accolades and
there's unit guidons, there's memorial walls, there's honor walls, there's awards, there's all kinds of things. Yeah.
And because we can't see your ailment, then it must not exist.
Absolutely.
And because it's not visible, because it is the mind and the brain, the mind, of course, you're well aware, is your brain is a physiological piece of meat.
Mm-hmm.
Uses 12 to 15 watts of energy. Not that I do a presentation about some of this, but your mind is the software that runs your brain. And you can have a physiological problem with your brain. There can be a chemical imbalance. There's a lot of ways to disrupt how the brain and mind work. Just like you can't solve eczema or, pick the seemingly benign, non-life-threatening issue. You can't fix this through willpower. And quite honestly, it takes a lot. It takes a lot of help from people. So your wife called, and I'm sure they were in shock, but I'm certain, I would bet my life, and I've never met any of these gentlemen, I would bet they were so happy that she called and you didn't take your life, because quite honestly, I have a close friend, and his daughter took her life on April 5th of 19. And it still sticks with me, as it will with him and all of her loved ones forever. You can't help the person that did take their life, but you're an example of a person who didn't, and that there is a path forward that ends in success. So,
absolutely. So
your wife called.
Yeah, that's right.
So what happened immediately after that?
Yeah, no, I'm very, very privileged. They made a house call, and came around and we spent a couple of hours talking, and I don't remember the whole conversation, but I do remember two questions they asked me right at the end. And the first was if I had a plan to kill myself. And I answered very honestly no at the time, despite the things that I've just said. And the reason I said no was because even though I'd worked out where and how to do it with a couple of different options, I hadn't yet put a date and a time in my calendar. So in my very regimented mind, which was also quite ill, I believed that I was only thinking about it and I didn't yet have a plan. What I now know about suicide, what I now know about a reasonable person's perspective, I absolutely had a plan. I just didn't see it for what it was at the time. And the other question they asked me was, okay, Kev, it's now out in the open, mate, but we're here now, and how do you feel now that we've been talking about this for a while? How do you feel about what's going to happen tomorrow and the next day? And I said, you know what? Up until now, I've been in just a black room, and I can't tell you how big the room is, except it's huge. But I've got no idea what shape it is, no idea which way to go. But now, somewhere out there, I can see the tiniest of doors, and I don't know how to get to it. I don't know how to unlock it. I don't know what's on the other side. I don't know what I'm going to find.
Or how far away it is.
I said, but all I know is it's a damn sight better than where I am now. And it absolutely was. It did take a while to get to that door. It did take a while to work out how to get through that door. But once I got through that door, then my whole life took on a whole new meaning. You know, I used to look back at that day as my deepest point of failure. I honestly felt I failed my country, the army, my parents, my wife, my children, my friends, everything. Like I'm not being dramatic. I'm not overstating that.
Confident you're not.
I really felt total, utter failure, and with that, total, utter shame. But I can now look back on that day without pride or shame and just see that as a day that ended one chapter and opened another chapter in my life, and now going on and serving in a whole new way.
And how fortunate you and your wife lived in an environment where help was one known phone call away.
Absolutely.
There are many people who are suffering, and not only do they feel what you felt, they didn't know what to do about it. And they didn't have the ability to contact someone who could help and start the process. They don't have anyone.
Yep.
Certainly I can understand and see how when you reach that point in your life, and I think unfortunately the suicide rate, as you said, points to this, when you see no way out, no way forward, and you are in your mind a disappointment in every way a person can be a disappointment, then in that mental state, people feel like the logical action is to terminate their own life. And I don't know that this is true. Again, this is Bruce Webb just speculating, but I've known a few people in my life, some better than others, who have taken their lives, died by suicide. In each case, they were people that I would consider to be very emotionally intelligent, articulate, introspective people. I don't know you, but I'm positive you're a very intelligent, clearly articulate, high-functioning person. My guess is, once you start down that path, it's hard to stop that slow spiral. And I think the spiral gets tighter. It's just so fortunate your wife was there.
Yeah.
And I think it doesn't have to be your wife. It can be anyone. Anyone is capable of helping someone.
Correct.
Or I do believe that when we have a feeling something's not right with someone, it's our obligation. Is it the right term? Maybe it is the right term. We need to, out of love for our friends and family, not ask, are you okay? Because I promise you, had someone asked, are you okay then? You said, oh, I'm fine.
Plenty of people had asked if I'm okay leading up to that. Absolutely.
But instead say, listen, Kevin, I know something's wrong. You need to talk to me about that. If you think there's a problem, don't call and ask if they need help. Don't call and ask if they want you to come over. Don't call. Just say, I'm coming. I'm coming. And if you're in Australia and you've got a friend in Butte, Montana, and they're your friend and you know that they're struggling, don't say, may I come? Because they're going to have a million reasons you shouldn't come. Just say, I'm coming. In a small way, although your wife is standing right beside you, I'm sure at that point, it really didn't matter what your response was going to be. She was calling.
Yeah, 100% she was.
Shame is such a personal emotion, and anyone who's not felt shame is probably not a human. But it's fascinating because I don't believe I've met someone who was ashamed of something where I felt I didn't judge them. I didn't cast aspersions. I don't think we do. Shame is mostly within ourselves and remains within ourselves, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I would be stunned to know that any person who knew you and loved you felt anything other than compassion for you.
Yeah, and that's exactly how it happened as I saw after the fact. But at the time, in my mind's eye, it was a completely different thing. And, now when I go around speaking to all different organizations and industries and whatnot, and, I've had a number of men come up to me after separate events. And one of the most common themes, believe it or not, is, mate, thank you. You give me permission to talk about my divorce. Now, I don't talk about divorce. I talk about a wife who never left me. But the common thread here is shame. they feel a level of shame in not being able to make their relationship work or whatever it is, right? And yes, but I don't judge anybody who has tried to make a marriage work and it hasn't worked out for whatever reason. Yeah, and it's I won't say it's the last place, but it's certainly not where I was looking for people to experience shame and an inability to talk about it. And when I asked my wife to keep it a secret because I didn't want anybody else to know, we kept that secret for 7 years until we, through business coaching, incredibly perceptive lady said to me, "Kevin, you're doing okay here with all the coaching milestones, but I know there's something you're not telling me. I just know that there's something there that you're hiding from me. And until you tell me everything, I can't help you fully." And it was through a whole bucket load of tears that eventually I let my secret out. And she challenged me to talk about it publicly, to release it publicly. And 2 months later, I did. I was in a coaching group, and but that's where I felt safe enough to release my secret. And when I did, 20 centimeters taller and 20 kilos lighter, like instantly. And I'm not kidding, men walking over tables to get to me, to give me a hug, to say, "Mate, your story's like mine. I just haven't got the guts to talk about it."
Right.
And it's just such a common theme.
I often say that the right thing is always the hard thing.
Absolutely.
It was really easier to hide it than it was to release it. But once it's released, the burden's gone. I think as well, even had you been able to suppress the need, I won't even say desire, because at that point, I'm not sure taking your life is a desire. I think almost at some point it becomes a need. It's this, there's this physiological aspect of it as well. In other words, I don't know this, but my guess is that your physical health was also suffering. In other words, you may have not had headaches before, but now you're having headaches, or you may have been having backaches or, intestinal distress. Mental health issues have a propensity to show up in physiological ways as well. I mean, your blood pressure might have been astronomically high. It's ironic that, a lot of the old wives' tales, you're killing yourself. Stress is killing you. Yeah, it can.
Yeah, absolute clear linkages, somatic illnesses where the body, there's a psychiatrist talks about, I'm trying to think of his name, that the body keeps the score, talking about how the body keeps track of traumatic events, right? And not just traumatic events, but all forms of mental illness. Absolutely. The body keeps all of that information and presents as different types of illnesses that quite often you can't put your finger on exactly what it is. 2 other panic attacks that I had later on. One was I thought I was having a heart attack, and I spent the day in the ED. Got checked out from top to bottom, and everything was pristine. Not anything to be found physically. It was psychological. And then a couple of years later, about 2.5 years later, sitting at home and thought I was having a stroke or a seizure. And thankfully, again, my wife was sitting, half the distance that you and I are in front of me at the time. And anyway, up to the emergency room again, all the scans, nothing there. It was another form of a panic attack for me. Yeah, our body is not some totally separate vessel from our brain and our mind. They are absolutely interconnected.
Right.
And the body presents itself in ways to get you to take notice, because you haven't been taking notice of all the other cues. So I'm going to make you take notice.
If you don't drink water, your muscles are going to cramp.
Yeah.
If someone hits your knee with a hammer, you're going to kick. We look at these physical responses to stimuli and we said, oh, of course, that's the reflex, or that's, the mind is similarly entwined in everything that you do. There's a lot of interesting studies about how we believe that, our brain is our primary source of information, or how controlling of our body. But there's a lot of evidence, or a lot of people speculate, hey, listen, really, it's your gut, it's your gastrointestinal tract, and, that fight or flight, the vasovagal nerve, and all the, we think we're all that in a bag of chips. We think we live in our prefrontal cortex, but our lizard brain, and deep within the cerebellum, deep below that, there's a lot of hardware there that we don't understand.
The gut is absolutely the first filter for the brain. And there's plenty that would argue that the gut is the first brain and everything else up top here is the second brain.
Right.
And and that's one of the big things is helping to control our mental health through our gut health.
Yes.
If you want better quality thoughts, you need to start. Step one is better quality food, better quality inputs. Because at the end of the day, the analogy of our brain being a computer is absolutely true. And computers will give you really bad information depending on the input that goes into it.
Right.
So if we want better quality outputs out of our computer, then we need to have better quality inputs into that thing. And it absolutely starts with what we put into our mouth, what we ingest.
And through our eyes, into our body or our ears, what we ingest intellectually as well. I mean, if you bathe yourself in bad messages, and also then you combine that with poor physical, you're not eating correct foods, you're eating, candy bars and soft drinks, and you're not exercising, and you're all, put turpentine in your helicopter and see how well it runs.
Exactly.
Don't maintain it and see how well it runs.
And that was absolutely true for me. I thought that the way for me to deal with the issues and problems that I knew I was having was to work harder and try harder. Work longer hours and do all these things rather than actually care for myself, actually look after myself. What's happened if the helicopter's running rough? You put it into maintenance and find out what's going on, right?
Right.
I wasn't doing that. And it's one of the things I talk about now is the concept of noble self-leadership. And that is honoring yourself and leading yourself first before you lead others. Because if you don't lead yourself first, you end up not being able to lead others, right? And you end up unwell.
Yes.
So just like when the oxygen mask drops from the ceiling, pull down on it to start the flow of oxygen, fit it over your nose and mouth securely, and start breathing normally. And even if the bag doesn't inflate, oxygen is flowing, right?
Right.
And fit your own mask first before helping others.
Right.
I didn't do any of that.
Right. Well, I think men are poor at that as well. I think women, as a rule, not all, in all cases, but at least in the American society, I think women have better social infrastructures to help. Men, we typically don't have very good social our social infrastructure is be a man. Just do it. Get through it, And again, many women suffer from mental health issues as well. I don't want to diminish that fact, but I do think that women as a whole, stereotypically or typically, have a better social network than men. I'm not a woman, of course, but I do know that it hits very hard with men.
I'll tell you the statistics. The statistics are that women are far more susceptible to mental illness than men, roughly 1.5 times, as a really broad generalization. Yeah. But men take their lives at a rate of 3 to 1.
And why don't they take their lives? It's just a social structure, do you think?
Well, it's an incredibly complex topic, but I do believe that at least one of the reasons why is that, generally speaking, women have a social structure to be able to express, to download, to share, to communicate, to connect. Now, there are other things about lethality of means and whatnot, and they're all very valid. But I do believe when we're just talking about this one area of social connections, then absolutely women are far better at that than us guys. And we need to get over ourselves as blokes, as guys, and be able to connect with others and open up and say, I'm not doing well.
Yeah. So Kevin and I are about the same age, roughly. And I do think
about 35.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
That's what I was thinking too. My parents and certainly my grandparents were very stoic. I am certain I've told my wife and children, I love them more in 1 week than my parents ever said in their whole lives. They just weren't people who said, I love you, and they weren't people that were huggers or you grew up. And I don't think that was an atypical, at least not atypical in my social strata as a farm kid in the Midwest. And to admit you had mental health issues, there's no way. I mean, and to your point, I think that generation certainly would rather take their lives than admit they have a problem. But, you were able to not suffer that fate. And I do think that by speaking about it here and other places, you'll help many people become confident enough to speak that and to take care of themselves. That's a tough step. That first step's got to be a tough step. But as you said, once you made it, once you took that step, you didn't know much about this space you're in, but you knew there was a glimmer of hope. So what happened? So did you, what tools or what help did you receive that you felt was most beneficial? I know that's kind of a loaded question, but how did you start working your way through this?
There were basically two parts to it. And one was intrinsic and the other was extrinsic. The extrinsic part was cognitive behavioral therapy, psychiatrist, psychologist, counselor, GP, looking at nutrition, looking at sleep, looking at a whole bunch of those factors, and starting to get myself back on track with the support of all of those people. And the intrinsic was changing the story I was telling myself about myself. And I don't know at what stage, but this phrase came to me, my mind got me into this, my mind will get me out of it. And I'd say it to myself again and again, but I'm a fairly visual guy. And every time I saw an image of myself, I saw the version of me that was convulsing on the ground. And I thought, I really need to change this picture. And so I remembered the $6 Million Man, the TV show from the 70s, Steve Austin, from the 70s and 80s. And so it's funny, depending on the room that I'm in, there's either chuckles in the audience or there's stone cold silence.
Yes,
they're going, who is that guy? But yeah, I loved that show as a teenager, and I got the image of him, running the bionic run, and put my head on his body in my head. And the good thing is he already had a mantra. We have the technology. We can rebuild him, make him better, faster, stronger than he was before.
Absolutely.
And so whether I was going to the psychiatrist's office, going for a run, getting an ice cream with the kids, trying to put a nail in a wall, I would see me as him and him as me and say, I have the technology. I can rebuild me. I'm going to make me better, faster, stronger than I was before. I'm going to rebuild my brain. And that became my mantra. And I would say that to myself again and again and again. I honestly lost count, hundreds, thousands of times that I said that to myself. And after about 9 months, I eventually got back to work. But I still had that deep-seated failure and shame. So even though I got back to being functional again, there was still that shame. And then found out I was being called damaged goods and various other things by the hierarchy at work. So it was time for me to leave the army and go and find a civilian job, which is where I ended up in.
How sad and disappointing that is, though. I mean,
I was sad. Well, let me tell you, sad and disappointing weren't the words I was using.
Sure
I was very angry and very bitter. But yeah, and it was. I'll tell you what made it more sad and disappointing was that I was now in a different unit with the exact same policies, but people enact policies. And the person who was now my boss in the new unit had a very different way of enacting the same policy that was being enacted somewhere else.
That's terrible.
And it really was. That's what was sad.
And the irony is, so it's almost like a bully. I believe bullies are bullies because what they see in you, they fear in themselves. And if you could really cut to the quick of the people who said you were damaged goods and you could really know them, I believe they were suffering the same thing and they didn't want to see them in you. I'm not a doctor, but I am a keen observer of human behavior. And I really think when people behave in a way that is evil, perhaps is too strong, but maybe it's not too strong. Certainly that behavior is unconscionable. I think it's fear. I think they fear. They see you and they see themselves, and that scares them. So what do you do if you don't like what you see? You get rid of it. And you're right, how we perceive things. I've talked about this many times, but I've had people, in fact, this happened just recently where a guy was telling me this was a young man, he said he was just a private pilot. And I said, that's fantastic. And I said, but never say the word just.
Absolutely.
You're a private pilot. Don't use words to diminish yourself, because whether you know it or not, they matter. And if you perceive yourself as just or only or, any of those potentially negative images of yourself, you harm you.
Couldn't agree more, mate. Could not agree more. Absolutely true.
So be proud. And, all things in the world happen for a reason. So you leaving that unit and you moving on.
Yeah.
In retrospect.
Best thing. The best thing that ever happened to me. Now, to get back to flying, I need to basically go back to square one. Full psychiatrist report, psychologist report, aptitude testing, neurological function testing, liver function testing, because I'd been abusing alcohol as part of the illness. So, yeah, had to go through the full barrage of tests to prove my medical fitness to fly, which came back and said, yes, he's okay to fly. And I needed to jump through a number of those hoops every year. With our CASA is, the same as your FAA, and they want to make sure that the person with the helicopter or with the aeroplane is truly fit to fly. And whilst I was very, very upset when I was originally grounded, because the cockpit was my happy place, right? But again, in hindsight, I can see how it may have been my happy place, but didn't mean I was fully fit to be in that happy place, particularly as a single pilot. And so I look back now with complete understanding that, yes, being grounded is totally appropriate, and until you get yourself well again, and then get back in the air. But yeah, I was able to, and then go on in the civilian EMS and SAR space. And and I've spoken to a number of pilots over the last few years who they've come to me and said, having a bit of a wobble. What do you reckon? Because they've got a level of reticence of going to the DAME is what we call it, but the AME, the medical examiner here. And I said, mate, just go and see the doc. Like, so much better to be well on the ground than unwell in the air.
Absolutely.
Go and see the doc. And yeah, you might be grounded for a short period of time, right? But then get yourself sorted out and get back in the air. They've all done a ground trial. This is in Australia. Did a ground trial with some medication, and I'm not pro or anti-medication. It works for some, it doesn't work for others in both regards, right? But for these guys, they did a ground trial for 4 weeks, got back in the air, they've been flying every day since.
It's fantastic.
As far as I'm aware, no more wobbles, right? They're looking after themselves now. They know how to lead themselves and put their own oxygen mask on first to maintain their well-being and maintain their health. Nipping it in the bud early, a whole lot better than going down the road that I went down.
And again, so success. I mean, people can have an event, recover from that, and then through a few steps, and I'm not trying to minimize the steps, but listen, they are just steps. You take them one at a time, and then the result is success.
Yep.
You're back to flying. And I don't want to, so I don't want to diminish that success by saying what I'm going to say, and I hope that it doesn't diminish it. But all of it is better than where you were. If you never flew another day in your life, but you were who you are today, but someone said, hey, listen, I'm sorry, but you will never fly again. Okay. You know what? There are many worse things.
Absolutely.
And so for you and for these other persons, they were able to achieve success through facing the demon, it's proof of how difficult it is how few people do face it. And unfortunately, the people who don't choose to take their life doesn't mean they don't live in that dark place still. So for the one every 11 minutes or so, I believe, that's taking their life, there's probably another 5 that are just trying, whatever. I shouldn't throw a number to it, but there are people that are just slogging through, not enjoying their life.
That's exactly right. And we can either enjoy life or we can endure. And let me tell you, enjoying it is so much better than enduring it.
Yes.
And it was the greatest realization around, the mental illness and flying in particular, came to me after one of the missions I did, back in Australia. We went and there was a party of 3 rock climbing on a very large cliff face, and an instructor and 2 novice climbers, and the instructor tragically fallen to his death, and left the 2 novices on the tiniest of ridges, outcroppings. And so we got the call to go down there and pick these 2 people off the cliff edge. And anyway, got down there, and the way we fly EMS and search and rescue for most operators, for most scenarios in Australia, is single pilot. Anyway, there we are, single pilot, a winch operator in the back, putting the rescue crewman down on the end of the cable to get these 2 people off one at a time. And it was because of the prevailing conditions and whatever else. It was actually a pretty challenging job. I realised after the mission that the 2 people with those 3 lives in their hands were 2 people with well-established histories of mental illness. So there was myself in the front flying it, and the winch operator in the back had been hospitalised 3 times with major depressive disorder.
Wow.
And yet, here we are now on the job, highly competent operational roles, with the 3 lives in our hands, and just completed the job. It was just another, and I don't say it to brag, as you said yesterday, I don't say it to humbly brag. I say it because it's just another day on the job, right, for EMS and SAR pilots. It's just what you do. But yeah, it was, at the end of that day, I sat back and went, wow, about perspectives and about taking and I've actually taken a photo off the GoPro. And you show it to people and say, what do you see? And it's a typical SAR scene, a typical search and rescue scene, rescue crewmen going out the door. So yeah, what about if I tell you the 2 guys operating that machine have got demonstrated histories of mental illness? Does that change your perspective about whether that helicopter's safe or not? Which brings me to a point, to a memory. When I first declared of my history, right, publicly, openly, to the medical examiners, I declared it all the way through. There was no surprises, nothing hidden there. But it was my own private information, so I wasn't shouting it from the rooftops. But when I shared my secret publicly, thought, you know what, I need to do the right thing and tell people at work firsthand so they hear it from me and they don't hear it through the grapevine somehow. Now, I was also the chief pilot at this stage. The day after, actually that afternoon, when after I told everybody about my past of having a breakdown and contemplating suicide, there were 2 anonymous reports put into the safety system saying that I wasn't fit to fly. 7 years after the fact, right? Now, and they were looked into and they were found to be completely vexatious. But it just goes to show, how do you clear a room? You start talking about mental illness, right? And so, for anybody out there who, has had people, when they have spoken up, had negative comments or whatever else, yep, they'll happen, and there will be some people in the workplace who for whatever reason may decide to take a swipe. But just know that, that's their issue, not your issue. And if you've got leadership of any value, then they'll see it for what it is and support you along the way. So
absolutely. I'm disappointed to hear that happens. I'm not surprised.
No.
I'm disappointed. It frightens people. If you want to achieve a level of illogical response from someone, frighten them. Frightened people don't behave logically. Frightened people, and again, I don't know the people who obviously complained or wrote the response, but it would be interesting to really run them through a battery of psychological exams and just see where they are.
Yeah.
I do think it would be telling Because quite honestly, it's much like I have another friend that had a heart attack probably now 10 years ago. And it took him 2 years to recover his medical. And much like you did, but it wasn't a psychological, it was a physiological. And he had to go through all these exams and tests and still does every year to retain his medical.
Yep.
The interesting thing is the persons that have never had a heart attack, they're an unknown. They're not tested.
Yep.
Because they've never had an issue. In other words, the most physiologically well-established person is that person who is tested every year. He goes through a battery of exams, but they're not testing me because I've never had a heart attack.
Exactly.
So I could be on the precipice of one.
Yep.
And I think mental illness is that way as well. I would argue that you're probably the most mentally fit person or one of the most mentally fit persons in the entire organization. Why? Because you've gone through it. You've you're examining people and you know how to look at yourself. And we know you're not afraid to say, help. And I do believe this conversation today, and I know that you do outreach. So you have an organization or you have outreach. You do this, you speak.
Yeah, that's right.
So tell us about all of that. What do you do to promote mental health?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that I do. So I'm a speaker, go around to different industries. Matter of fact, last week I was with UND, talking to their
My
entire
cousin got his certificates from UND, University of North Dakota.
Yep. So I spoke to their whole aerospace campus last week, and absolutely fantastic time. And so I'm changing the conversation around mental health and mental illness, particularly in aviation, but across all industries. I've spoken to, whether it's finance or energy or construction or whatever the case may be. But obviously my background is aviation. But if you've got a heart and a brain, you're susceptible to mental illness, and it doesn't matter what industry you're in. So I go around speaking to industries, run workshops and programs and whatnot, particularly around the notion of noble self-leadership. And the other thing that I created a not-for-profit is what we call it in Australia. I can't remember. There's a phrase.
We would here as well.
Yeah. Called Cor Infinitus, which is Latin for infinite courage. And what that is putting in anonymous memorials, very modest, small memorials, all around the country in Australia, dedicated to those who've served and taken their own lives. Now, it's not to glorify any of those people, and it's not to glorify the act of suicide. What it's for is to give dignity and respect to the families of those people who have taken their own lives, because it's the families who are left behind with all kinds of questions and all kinds of concerns about what could have been done, what happened, what didn't happen. And there's messaging, there's unique messaging on these memorials as well, so that it's not just a memorial to suicide. And as I said, it's totally anonymous. It's not dedicated to any individual. But there's messaging on there so that it actually acts as a suicide prevention tool as well, with help numbers as well for people to call. But yeah, so I do a couple of different things around that.
So if someone wanted to reach out to you, so first of all, I'd like to give a shout out to UND. Again, I don't know that school well, other than, again, my cousin got his fixed wing and his rotary wing certificates there. Now flies an Airbus H-145 actually in Peoria, Illinois. So he's had a very successful career, and I think it can be traced back to a very successful education. And it's impressive to me that UND or schools like UND would invite persons like you to give presentations. Knowing about mental illness and being able to cope and to succeed is every bit as valuable, more valuable than knowing how to shoot an ILS.
Absolutely. An ILS you got to do in the cockpit. Looking after yourself and being mentally well is every minute of every day.
Every day.
Yeah. And indeed, UND Aerospace, so they just started last year their own peer support program for their students. Right. So and it's for students by students. There's a lot of operational organisations out there that don't have peer support programs yet. These guys have got it running now in the schoolhouse, which is just fantastic.
Oh, sure. And they'll take that when they move out of the schoolhouse and they move into their operational lives.
Yep.
They'll take that with them. It's
Correct.
just another skill they have.
That's it. And so it's generational change in a really, really good way.
That is fantastic. Yeah. So let's imagine I wanted to get a hold of you. I want to invite you to come speak at Airbus or at an event. How do I get a hold of you?
Yeah, so you go to my website, which is my name. So www.kevinhumphreys.com.au, because Australian, but I do come back to the States and come and speak. And Humphreys is spelled Humphereys. Or you can find me on LinkedIn or on Facebook as well, and I'm pretty active there.
Super. Well, we've reached our clearance limit, Kevin. I'd love to talk to you more, but I think your message is super important. I think it's wonderful that you would share that with not only us, but the world. I mean it when I say you will have a great positive impact on every person who listens to this. And you're a credit to our industry and a credit to humanity. I know that sounds very dramatic but we don't often have an opportunity to meet someone who does something exceedingly brave and that's willing to share that. And so thank you. I do mean that.
Thank you, Bruce. Thanks very, very much. It's been an absolute privilege and a pleasure to sit down with you and have a chat, mate.
Pleasure's been mine. So until next time, resume own navigation.
The information provided during this podcast, Push to Talk with Bruce Webb, is made available for general information and educational purposes only. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily represent those of Airbus Helicopters, Inc. or its affiliates.